Good evening and welcome to the New York Society Library. I'm Jenny Lawrence, a longtime member. At most of you know, we're the city's oldest library. Our founders in 1754 envisioned building a collection of books and thereby creating a society of readers. In our 270 years, this society of readers has not only endured but flourished. We are in the midst of a renovation that will significantly, ingeniously, maximize space for books and people for at least, we hope, another 100 years. Let's now go straight to our subject tonight, Jean Strouse on her new book, Family Romance, John Singer Sargent and the Wertheimers in conversation with Stacy Schiff. Jean is the author previously of Morgan, American Financier, and Alice James, a biography, which won the Bancroft Prize in American History and Diplomacy. Jean was a book critic at Newsweek from 1979 to 1983 and won a MacArthur Fellowship in 2001. She has also held fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for Humanities, and the National Endowment for the Arts. From 2003 to 2017, she was director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. Stacy is the author of Vera, Mrs. Vladimir Nabokov, which won the 2000 Pulitzer Prize. Her other biographies are on Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, Benjamin Franklin, Cleopatra, the Salem Witches, and most recently, Samuel Adams. Stacy has received numerous fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Cullman Center at the New York Public Library. She was named a 2011 Library Lion by the New York Public Library, a Boston Public Library Literary Light in 2016, and in 2017 received the Lifetime Achievement Award in History and Biography from the New England Historic Genealogical Society. This is truly a special occasion. Two exceptional biographers, friends, library philiacs, and, I might add, longtime members of the New York Society Library, in conversation about John Singer Sargent and his commission from Asher Wertheimer to paint 12 family portraits between 1898 and 1908. We learn much about the painter, as much about the Jewish London art dealer, his family, the art world, and perhaps the richest of all the portraits, Edwardian England before World War I. As Jean writes, the dazzle and the unease of a world in radical flux. Richard Holmes, in Footsteps, Adventures of a Romantic Biographer, called the biographical process a haunting, an act of deliberate psychological trespass, an invasion or encroachment of the present upon the past, and in some sense, the past upon the present. Just so Jean's process, a haunting that keeps us page-turning family romance to its finale. From the Wall Street Journal, a book as finely crafted as the portraits it describes. From the New York Times, Strouse confronts prejudice unblinkingly, but with an historian's grace for evolving mores. And from the New Yorker, Strouse has an astute eye for the era's swerves and twists. I read and shivered and tried unsuccessfully to think of other sub-300-page works of nonfiction that deserve to be called epic. Jean and Stacy bring their insights as biographers to bear on these portraits, just as John Singer Sargent exercised his consummate artistry in creating them. And now to Jean and Stacy.
Thank you, and thank you for all for braving the element, I guess, tonight.
and to come out for this dazzling book. I want to dive straight in, Jean. Sargent allegedly said that every time he painted a portrait, he lost a friend, a claim that your book belies. But to pose for him could be dangerous. As someone remarked, to sit for John Singer Sargent was to take your face in your hands. It could also be grueling work for the subject, and all his subjects were not pleased with the result. Flora Wertheimer famously had her portrait redone 6 years later, which we can talk about. So before we look more closely at these dazzling pictures, can you talk a little bit about the mechanics behind them?
Yes, sure. First of all, I just want to thank everybody involved in this, the library, Sayer, Holiday, Jenny Lawrence, and you, Stacy, for doing this. So it's really a pleasure to be here. Sargent occasionally painted quickly. There were 2 or 3 paintings that he did in 3 or 4 sittings, but usually it took much longer than that. There was a picture of young children in Paris. The little girl hated the whole process and complained that there were 83 sittings, which it was impossible, but it was part of her complaint. Mostly, he was a very genial companion. People enjoyed hanging out with him. Often he would take a little break and play the piano, or he would be humming for a while as he was painting. His method was usually to stand back, to have the sitter in the distance, the easel next to him, in front of him, and he was standing back several paces behind the easel. And they were sort of both in his vision, and he would look and look until he saw what he wanted, and then he would dash forward to the canvas and hit the canvas with his brush. Some restorations of the paintings found thick pieces of the brush embedded in the paint, which was, I think that happens with all paintings, but especially with him with this method. So it was an undertaking to sit for him, but I think for most people, and particularly for Asher Wertheimer, it was also a lot of fun. They became very close friends in the process.
So it occurs to me this is a book about outsiders. You give us continental Jews who are making their fortunes in a very class-bound milieu, and an artist who, for all his success, is American to the British and British when he's in America, who's at home everywhere and at home nowhere. So do you want to talk about how those two worlds came to intersect? Because what you've written about is really an outsider painting outsiders, or if I can reduce it to 3 words, assimilation by portraiture, and something that yields really the greatest series of paintings, really the greatest private commission of Sargent's career, right?
Yes, the largest, certainly, and many people thought they were the greatest of his portraits. Many people did not. They were extremely controversial. We'll get back to that in a minute. I don't know how Asher and Sargent met. Asher had an art gallery in New Bond Street, and Sargent certainly would have frequented it, but I don't have a recording of their meeting. But yes, different kinds of outsiders. Sargent, just to give a quick sketch, his parents were American. They were from Philadelphia, descended from old New England shipping trade family in Boston, and they had a baby who died, this couple, and they went to Europe to cheer up Mrs. Sargent and never came back. So Sargent was born in Florence in 1856 by the Arno, and his maternal grandmother, who was traveling with them, living with them essentially, called him Fra Giovanni. And they went everywhere. They had enough, they weren't fabulously wealthy, but they were comfortable enough to be able to do this, so that Dr. Sargent, he was a physician, never worked again. They went to the mountains for good weather in the hot months and to the south in the cold months. So Sargent was fluent in French and Italian, familiar with more cultures than most Americans would ever see, and obviously from very early on, an incredibly gifted artist as well as musician. At one point in his career, he thought he might have to give up painting after the famous Madame X debacle, which we might talk about. And he thought he could become a musician or a businessman. I think businessman would probably not have been a very good choice, but musician would have been fine. So, and Asher Wertheimer's father had come from southern Germany to London in 1839. He was craftsman in bronze and very quickly became a dealer in bronze and in the kinds of 18th century French furniture that the markets absolutely wanted at that time. He, I don't know quite how they met either, but he became a principal dealer to the Rothschilds and to some members of the royal family. So he went up in a very rapid rise, and both of his sons also became art dealers. Asher was the second son, the elder was Charles, and they both continued in this. It was an amazing moment in the art market as British aristocrats and other European aristocrats were selling their inherited art, and the new money people, mostly American, some British industrialists, some South Africans, wanted exactly what these families had. So the Wertheimers were right at that pivot between the old owners of art and the aspirational owners of art.
But there's a price to be paid for that old masterly treatment of these newly wealthy people. Whereas they're described at one point in The Spectator, the Jews are these over-civilized European Orientals. Anti-Semitism is never really far from the page. At one point, another Jewish subject is described as, this is the best, an Englishman of the Jewish persuasion, no matter how comparatively unpersuaded he might be. So tell us about the climate in which Sargent is working and what you make of the timing here. You slipped the Dreyfus case in very deftly. And I know you said to me at one point that you didn't think you were writing a book about anti-Semitism. When did it occur to you that you were writing a book about anti-Semitism?
Well, I wouldn't say it's only a book about anti-Semitism, but the responses to these paintings mean that that subject absolutely cannot be ignored. It was from the very beginning, and the first portrait of Asher was shown at the Royal Academy in 1898. And let's look at that for a minute. There it is. This is, as a friend of mine who's in the audience said when he first saw it, this is a Jew. This is what he looked like. In the book, there are photographs of them, so you can compare the painting with the photograph. But he and Sargent had a very close, friendly relationship. They were both well-schooled in the history of art. There's a lot of Velázquez and Frans Hals in this portrait, which Asher would absolutely recognize. And so I think they were having fun, and I think Sargent was extremely good at capturing character, which he sees in all the Wertheimers and is excited by. He loved visual drama. But many people saw it as a fiercely anti-Semitic portrait. Asher's lips are red, and there's in the lower right-hand corner, there's his dog, a poodle named Noble, whose tongue is hanging out of his mouth, which sort of exaggerates or emphasizes that idea of Jews, carnal appetite and Jews. So you can read it in many, many ways. And that was, when it was first shown, it was compared to a Rembrandt at the Royal Academy, and one of the critics said, "Lucky is a man whose portrait has been painted thus." And that went on, the praise throughout the life of this painting. But at the same time, an American who came into the studio, whose portrait was also being painted at the same time as Asher Wertheimer, this was Ian Phelps Stokes, he said of this painting that Asher looks as if he's pleasantly engaged in counting golden shekels. Ooh, right. And Asher left 9 of these paintings to the National Gallery, and he and his wife had a life interest in them. So he died in 1918, she died in 1922. They were given to the gallery, which was very eager to have them in 23. They went up immediately that January. And there was a debate about them in Parliament. And in the committee holding the debate, one of the members asked the head of the committee, "Can't you manage it so that we don't have to have these repulsive pictures on our walls for all time next to the beautiful examples of the work of Turner?" So that duality has been there. And just quickly, the paintings went from the National Gallery to the Tate, and they've been in storage for most of the 20th century. They've begun to emerge now, but they really were sort of buried.
Since you mentioned that, the book opens with that discussion.
Yes.
It's kind of jaw-dropping to think that these paintings could have been in storage or could be so could be found to be repulsive. Why did you decide to open the book there?
To set the drama, I think that, I mean, as I said, I was not intending to write so much about anti-Semitism, but there's no getting around it. It's so much, the subject of these paintings is so saturated with those responses. And you mentioned Oriental a minute ago. I had no idea Jews were regarded as Oriental. And that the response to many of these paintings, not just of the Wertheimers, but others, is these exotic Oriental people. Other, not us, not Western. And Sargent, of course, didn't come in for any of that because he was Anglo-Saxon. He was other in that he was American, but he was painting the British upper classes at the same time as American elites, at the same time as quite a number of Jews with whom he became very good friends.
Well, it touches on something I want to talk about, which is it does not go unremarked that he paints a lot of what seem to be a lot of Jews. And one crack will be that he prefers Jewesses as they have more life and movement than our English women.
That's attributed to him. He said,
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. So you did the math. The figure is 5%
Yeah.
of all of the existing.
Paint portraits and charcoal sketches. There are about 1,300 total, and about 70 of those are of Jewish people. Some of them he did more than once, so the percentage is actually a little smaller, but it's about 5%. That was enough to earn comment, to get him known as painter of Jews. And the thing you just quoted was his portrait of Lady Sassoon, who was born a Rothschild, was shown at the Royal Academy in 1907, and a poet visiting with another poet friend said, Sargent paints nothing but Jews and Jewesses now, and says he prefers them as they have more life and, I want to just get to, well, back to the two sisters. Well, yeah, the two sisters, you see that more life and warmth than our English women. And you see that in this portrait of the two oldest Wertheimer sisters.
There's also, along with the anti-Semitism, there's a clash here between old and new money, obviously, which perhaps takes priority. As someone says of a Rothschild estate, it was an exaggerated nightmare of gorgeousness and senseless and ill-applied magnificence. There's clearly a resentment here about men who have transmitted fame to posterity through art in the same way that you might transmit money through legal means. And obviously there's some truth to that, as here we are a century later discussing the Wertheimers. So you must have had fun with this. Did you have visions of J.P. Morgan dancing in your head? Did this feel like familiar territory as you were writing about some of the Gilded Age craziness?
It did. I did learn a lot about that in the Morgan book, but I wasn't really writing about Jews then, and Morgan himself was not wildly anti-Semitic, although his son was. But yes, these new fortunes were so sneered at by the old fortunes, although as most of you probably know, the British aristocracy in those years was in steep decline, losing power, status, and certainly income. Anyone watching Downton Abbey has no need of evidence about that. And they, meanwhile, America was minting what Bernard Berenson called squillionaires.
A very useful term today.
Yes, indeed. And British industrialists in the North. So the older families had these great houses, these great properties, these beautiful children. They might sell their sons and daughters to rich Americans, as Lord Grantham marries. His wife is Jewish, Levinson. I can't remember her first name in Downton Abbey, but Cora. So they might marry their children to rich Americans, but they didn't want to sell their houses or their property, but they could sell their art. And that was exactly where the Wertheimers came in, trading between those old families and the new ones who wanted. It was a very, very risky market. There were just beginning to be standards for attribution and authentication. Connoisseurship was just coming into being. And it was a very expensive marketplace, speaking of Morgan. So a great guarantee of authenticity was an honest dealer. There were many who were not so honest, but Asher Wertheimer and his father actually were. But also, if a Rembrandt had been in a family for 300 years, that was a pretty good guarantee that it was the real thing. Whereas if it had just come on the market and was floating around, that was sketchier. So buying at estate sales, which is very much what the Wertheimers and several other dealers did, was very, very wise.
Do you want to talk for a minute about Wertheimer's taste? Because he has magnificent taste, and in business sense, but
Yes.
the collecting eye is rather extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. And there was a young journalist who was working for American and British publications who was delegated to find out what was coming up in the art market. And he came to see Asher Wertheimer, who said, I'm not going to talk to you about that. It's private. You know, we don't reveal those secrets, but I'll educate you if you like. So, and he took this young man under his wing and sort of showed him what was going on if he promised not to write about it. It's hard to know how he and his father learned about this. I mean, obviously, they paid attention to what was going on in the marketplace. The Rothschilds were, as I said, principal clients to all of the Wertheimers for several decades. And what they wanted and what the markets in general wanted was 18th century French decorative arts, gorgeously wrought materials, and old master portraits. So that was very much what the Wertheimers came to specialize in, except for a daughter we might get to later. But especially Asher had grown up with a father who was an art dealer, so he had learned about art from the very beginning. How his father, a penniless immigrant from Bavaria, figured out what was called for in this marketplace and what was real and good and what was fake and not good is just quite astonishing. Another thing that was interesting to me is how many Jewish art dealers there were in this period. Some of the reasons could be that it was a very international business. Jews spoke many languages. For various reasons, they lived all over the world, and they often had Jewish, Yiddish, or Hebrew in common, mostly Yiddish. So they had networks for learning. Also, it's a culture that's saturated in knowledge and learning and reading. So they would be eager to learn fields that required a great deal of specialization, and had networks for referring clients and experts to each other.
Do we have the portrait of Alfred in your deck?
Yes.
There's a tragic story behind this really exquisite portrait, and I thought you might want to tell it, and also to tell us about how you went about excavating this tale.
Alfred's story, yes. So this was the second son, who, like Asher and his brother, went to the University College schools, which were open to all kinds of non-Anglican boys. The private schools, which they called public schools, were not. So University College School was open to dissidents and Quakers and Jews. So they went there, but Asher's sons all went to Harrow and Oxford and Cambridge, which was not much fun, but they did get very good educations. This one, the second son, Alfred, actually didn't finish at Cambridge. He was a chemist. You see the two glass flasks on the wall behind him. And he was obviously very good looking. He left Cambridge and went to work with a chemistry company and wrote a few articles, but he really wanted to be an actor. And he has the looks for it, but his father would absolutely not hear of it. They fought bitterly, and Sargent tried to intermediate and intervene. And there are a couple of wonderful letters from Sargent to young Alfred saying, you know, your father's quite serious about this. He means to cut you out without a penny if you persist in this interest, and come talk to me, have lunch with me after my school's at the Royal Academy, and we'll figure out what you should do. So Alfred didn't budge, and his father didn't budge. And then there's another letter in which Sargent says, Alfred had apparently lent money borrowed money from his father and loaned it to someone, and that it had disappeared. So Sargent says, say that you loaned the money to me, I will pay it back to you tomorrow, and then you can repay your father. So in other words, trying to erase this problem. And he said, we won't have to touch the stage with a 10-foot pole, because the stage was still a very lively bone of contention between them. This painting was shown at the Royal Academy in 1902. It was a huge success. People, and it made Alfred kind of a star. Would walk around Mayfair, and people would stop him and say, "Oh, you're that guy." He had been to South Africa earlier that year with a friend, and he went back to South Africa that fall with the same friend and died. He was 29, and some people said that he was in the Boer War, which he wasn't. And it was a long process of trying to find out about this, but partly thanks to the Mormons, who keep really good records. He died in his hotel room in Johannesburg, and he was identified as a friend of this guy he had traveled with, Harry Freeman Cohen, who was a very wealthy, also British Jew, a founder of the Rand Daily Mail and a trader in gold. And he died in his hotel room. And I actually found the inquest, and he had died of an overdose of morphine, which he was addicted to. As a chemist, he probably was able to get access to it. And at the inquest, they called the local pharmacist, who said that he had actually known about Alfred's problem. The package of morphine had been picked up from his pharmacy and taken to Alfred's hotel. That he had known about the addiction, was trying to help him get off of morphine, and he didn't know about what was in this package, and he was acquitted. He was not blamed for the death. But it's a horrible, horrible story. And he was buried, his entrails were buried in South Africa, and then his body was taken back to London, and he's in the cemetery near his parents. Although I didn't know much about this, but suicides often are not accepted in the same cemetery with people who have died of natural means. But he's there, as is his slightly older brother, who I will tell you very briefly about, also died in his 20s. He was the eldest son, and he was in business with his father. He was the only one who was going to go into the art business in the next generation. He got married in 2 months after Alfred died, went on his honeymoon to Paris, and ate a bad oyster and died.
I like the morphine situation better.
Yeah, really. Yeah, and of typhoid, which a bad oyster could carry. So that was just horrifying.
Do we have both portraits of Flora?
Yes.
Because this is what happens when you lose two sons in quick succession.
So that is the first portrait of Mrs. Wertheimer, painted at the same time as Asher's. Well, you've seen Asher's. And it's beautiful. She was beautiful. She was also from an art dealing dynasty. They married in 1871. She did not like this, or I certainly know that she didn't like this painting, but I think Asher didn't either. She said, according to her descendants, that it made her look too rich. There's another painting that I don't have in the slideshow of Mrs. Carl Meyer and her children, who was also wearing a lot of pearls and fancy fabrics. And maybe it made her look too much like that. Sargent was very, very active in choosing what his sitters wore. I don't know if any of you saw a show on Sargent in Fashion that was in Boston a couple of years ago, and then at the Tate. It was a wonderful show, and he would make people bring 4 or 5 outfits, sometimes send them home to choose something else. He knew what he wanted this painting to look like. So I don't know about this, whether he chose these clothes or she brought them, but she certainly agreed to wear them. And it's a lot of lace and a lot of pearls and diamonds, and she just didn't like it. So there were other people who didn't like their portraits, but Sargent didn't do a second one for most of them, but he did this one 6 years later, by which time both of those sons had died. And this is a majestic portrait. It's totally different than the first one. She's grave, reserved. Her pallor sort of echoes the Chinese little dragon on the table next to her. So this is the one they kept, and Asher hung eight of the paintings in the dining room at his house in Connaught Place, which Sargent visited so regularly, it was known as Sargent's Mess. He loved good food, and the Wertheimers had excellent cooks. So this was opposite Asher in the dining room in Sargent's Mess, and it was part of his gift to England at his death. The first one, the previous one, they gave it to one of their daughters, and she ultimately sold it. It's now at the New Orleans Museum of Art. So 9 of the portraits were given to the National Gallery, and then there was another one of the eldest daughter, Ina, that came later.
Since you hit, why don't we go there right away? She's at full sail, and this picture sails twice across the ocean. Right? It has a really, really curious history. So it's such an extraordinary picture. Do you want to just fill us in? And this painting would seem to confirm that there was some kind of animated quality to Jewish subjects. I mean, it's just all about movement, right? It
is. And the first one of the 2 girls, they look like they're about to step out of the canvas into the room and into their lives. So, excuse me, she was definitely Sargent's favorite. And this was in the first painting of the 2 of them 2 girls was done in 1902. This was 2 years later. She was going to art school at the time. She was about to get married. She came into Sargent's studio in a rush, which she often was, and her coat and scarf and skirt were billowing out behind her, and he decided he wanted to paint her that way, in full sail, which in Italian is avec le gonfie. So this painting is called avec le gonfie, and it's a pure lark. The Duke of Marlborough was sitting for his portrait with his family at the same time. Mostly they posed at Blenheim Palace, and his wife was Consuelo Vanderbilt, who had unwillingly married the Duke. He needed her fortune, and her mother wanted her to have a title, so it was an unhappy marriage from the beginning, and they separated not long after Sargent did the portrait. But it's a very formal, stiff portrait that was supposed to go opposite, and did go opposite, a Reynolds portrait of an earlier Duke of Marlborough and his family. So the Duke and his family were sitting at Blenheim Palace, but he also came into London to the studio for Sargent to do more of him, and he wore his cloak for the Royal Order of the Garter, which is the most senior honorary title you can have. There are only 25 people at a time who have it. It was all men until King Edward made his wife, Alexandra, a Lady of the Garter. But so the outfit is this blue velvet cloak and a hat with ostrich feathers. And the Duke wore that for his sittings with Sargent, and Sargent and Ina picked up. I don't know whether it was literally the same cloak or the idea of that cloak, that he got another huge piece of dark blue velvet. It actually looks black in that painting, and swathed Ina in it. But after she'd been half naked in the earlier portrait with that low-cut dress, here she is swathed in masculine black, and that fabulous hat with its fabulous feathers. And he put a little gold vest under it to give a little color near her face, and she's looking back, laughing, as I think they were doing throughout this process. So here she is, female, not a member of the Royal Order of the Garter, Jewish, not a British aristocrat, dressed in the most noble clothes that you could have in the British Empire. There's sticking out behind her is what you see. It was a broomstick. He asked her to hold that to sort of poof out the cloak a little bit to make it look like she had looked coming into his studio in full sail. Some people thought it was a sword. There was a cartoon in Punch at around this time about her as a dashing cavalier saying, "Call yourself a soldier, look at me." So he loved sort of transgressive typing, going against type, and I think he and Ina were just having a ball.
Quickly, do you want to talk about why the painting makes this quick round trip?
Yes, so let me make a little footnote first, which is that we'll do the painting first. Ina opened a gallery of her own in 1925. Her family it had all been men, and they had dealt, as I said, in 18th century French decorative arts in old master paintings. And the gallery stopped with her father's death in 1918. There were no sons, and no sons of her uncle that continued the Wertheimer name in the art dealing business, which is partly why the firm is less well known than others that continued into the 20th century. But Ina in 1925 opened an art gallery opposite Claridge's. It was called the Claridge Gallery, and she wanted to show modern art, which she did. And she opened with a show of Sargent, who had just died, of watercolors that he had given to members of her family. And many things that Sargent had given to her family were on display at this exhibition, but not this painting, because it was in New York for sale. And it was bought by a man named Charles Deering, who was a friend of Sargent's. The McCormick Harvester fortune was behind him, and Sargent painted him, and he bought other paintings that Sargent's subjects had sold. But Ina's husband did not at first know about this. She sold it sort of out from under him. It had been a wedding present. He said it was to both of them. She said it was just to her. He couldn't prove it. So it went to America in 1925. And Ina died in 1936. And her husband was a little baffled about where the painting was, but he managed to find it and to buy it back. So it went across the Atlantic in 1925 and came back in 1936.
I just love that story about marital harmony.
Yes.
We had to throw that in. Sargent is hailed for his sensory revelation of character. As a painter who could drag the truth out of the superficial and pretty much pin a soul to the canvas. Yet he paints 3 self-portraits, which, unless I'm missing something, surrender no clues whatsoever to his personality. Do you have some? Good, excellent. So I'm wondering where that leaves the parched biographer.
Well, there you have Sargent's third self-portrait. It was done for the Uffizi Gallery, which had a lot of self-portraits by artists. It's certainly very well done and completely unrevealing. The eyes are not the window on the soul for this painting, compared to Rembrandt, who did scads of self-portraits, and they're profound. I mean, you do feel his soul, his being in those paintings. Sargent, not going there. He was reserved. Everyone who knew him said he was very, very private. He was, we assume, gay. There's no evidence of an actual relationship, but it was certainly his sensibility. He did dozens and dozens of sketches, paintings of nude men, very few of nude women, although that was conventionally the subject for a great many artists. And self-portraits are the subject for a great many artists. The subject is right there. You don't have to go very far. You don't have to hire a model. Sargent was not interested in portraying himself. The other 2 are similarly unrevealing. He did a couple of sketches, but it's telling you, I'm not telling you.
I think it's particularly striking because the letters seem to be so sprightly.
Yes.
So let me just talk for a minute, and then we're going to open things up to questions about Sargent's impossible penmanship. It was so illegible that after Ina died, her husband, wondering if the 2 of them had an affair, wanted to read the correspondence, but he couldn't make head or tails of Sargent's handwriting, correct?
Exactly.
So he turned the letters over to his daughter, and she couldn't read them, and neither could an aunt.
Right.
You could, however.
Yes.
So I suspect I know what you're up against because I've had this problem once or twice before, but is it like learning a new language? How did you go about it, and did you feel like you were missing things?
I did learn, it is like learning a new language, and you just do it and do it. Henry James, who I'd written about early on, had impossible handwriting. Sargent's is worse. which is somewhat surprising since he was a visual artist. You'd think he would care about how his handwriting looked, but he didn't. And you just learn it. It is like learning a new language. And just a little further about that packet of letters. Robert Matthias, who was Ina's husband, found those letters and gave them to, he couldn't read them, his daughter couldn't read them. And he said to her, do you think Mummy had an affair with Sargent? Which was a little clueless of him, but I mean, they were very close. And she took them to her aunt, who was the girl in the red dress in that painting of the two of them. They were very close, those two sisters. They talked on the phone almost every day. And she asked Betty if she could read the letters, and she couldn't. And she asked her father's question about an affair with Sargent. And she said, oh, don't be silly, darling. Everyone knew he was only interested in Venetian gondoliers. That story comes up in another place as told as a remark of her mother. So it was definitely the story in the family. And I think if that was their attitude, it helps explain how comfortable he was with them, because they were accepting him as he was.
I think we're going to turn to questions, but I just want to mention something that you cite because you are a master of citation in this book. And one of the quotes is the Michael Kimmelman quote, which is, maybe Sargent never experienced sex, but he certainly knew how to paint it.
Yes, that's a wonderful quote about a wonderful painting.
So I have a microphone that we can pass around if somebody's got questions they want to include. Is there a question?
And if not, I have 150 more.
Yeah.
If one just behind you, sorry.
This
has been fascinating, thank you. My question is, what was Asher's response to the anti-Semitism he encountered? What was Asher's response to the anti-Semitism he encountered?
In response to the paintings, you mean, or in his life?
Both, really.
There's almost no record of what the Wertheimers thought about anything. That was one of the huge challenges of this project for me. The firm's records were destroyed. There were I managed to find through the descendants some letters and documents and photographs, but I have no idea what Asher thought about most things. Some of his friends apparently took offense at the portrait of him, and Jewish friends, because they thought it was so anti-Semitic. He clearly did not, since he commissioned Sargent to do 10 more of all of his children, and they became very good friends. He went over to Sargent's studio almost every Sunday and had him to his house outside of London, as well as to his dining room, Sargent's mess. Portraits of this scale and style were the province of royalty, of nobility, of popes, of statesmen, not of Jews for the most part. So it was shocking for Britain to see these in the National Gallery alongside Lawrence and Reynolds and Gainsborough. I think that's what Asher had in mind, that his family would belong on those walls. He himself knew this art history very, very well. He chose the leading portrait artist of the time to render his family this way. And it was sort of a collaboration between them. And I think he was extremely comfortable with who he was. His circle was mostly Jewish in London, but they knew lots of people in lots of directions. The kids, the children were much more widely integrated into London society, but Asher was comfortable in many, many directions. I think he's saying, this is who I am. This is what I look like. And I'm fine with that. I think, but people disagree.
I wonder, I noticed you had many other slides in your deck, and I wondered if you wouldn't mind talking about a few of the other ones that we didn't have a chance to hear about yet.
Sure. Let's see. There's this one. I love this one. It's the younger children done in their schoolroom. You can barely see it, but there's a globe but very much behind them in the rear. This was one of the ones that was most really described as Oriental. It's as if, I mean, it's, I wish I could find it quickly, but it's sort of almost the air we feel smells of incense I mean, it's just like so exoticizing the way people responded to it. It's a dark, sensual, richly colored painting, that's true, but it's not of a harem in Tangier, which is how they describe it. And speaking of Orientalism, that's the youngest daughter, Almina. It's another, I think, lark portrait of Sargent's. He was also close to her, and this is somewhat based on a painting by Ingres, Odalisque with a slave, and she's sort of the slave, and she's dressed in a Turkish. Sargent collected exotic costumes and took them on his travels and put his friends and relatives in them and had them posed that way. So this is Almina posing in this Turkish men's coat that he had. And she's holding an Indian instrument called a sarod. She's holding it upside down. You could possibly play it that way. But in 18th century Europe, there was a huge fad for Turkery, as the Ottoman Empire was trading with the European aristocracy. That's when Ottomans became an item that everybody wanted in their sitting room. Ladies, queens would give parties where everybody had to come dressed as a Turk of one stripe or another. And painters painted lots of women in this Turkish garb. So Sargent is referring to that as well as to this Ingres painting. And I think it's sort of a triple play because here is a Jewish girl called Oriental, posing in Oriental clothing like an Ingres painting, and also posing like an 18th century aristocrat in Oriental garb. So I think it's another way in which he's very richly playing with the Wertheimers and playing with art history.
Jean, could you talk a bit about the challenge of balancing Sargent versus the Wertheimers versus the art?
Yeah, it was a tricky thing to balance, obviously, because, well, first of all, I should say that I've written books about one person in the past. So there was this obvious structure beginning birth to death. This did not have an obvious structure, and it was a lot of people. So, and I had to figure out how to talk about them in a way that wasn't just sort of, now we have to talk about that sister. And Sargent was completely appealing character. He's, as Stacy mentioned, his letters are delightful. I mean, they're impossible to read, but they're witty. He was a very warm friend and thoughtful and playful. At one point he says to Ina, why won't some of my sitters' portraits get finished? I've tried giving my nephews bumps to some of them. And that's not a great example, but he's funny and charming and incredibly generous to people like Alfred Wertheimer, but also to younger painters who weren't nearly as good as he was or as successful as he was. And he was really introducing them to his patrons and clients and helping them along. So I fell completely in love with Sargent. I liked him when I began, and I loved him by the time I finished. The Wertheimers were much harder to get to know because there was so little documentation. And Sargent, too, it's their letters, their notes, but they're not like the James family or J.P. Morgan, who had a basement full of papers. And then there was the art, which I didn't really know how to read. So I had to learn to read that, like I had to learn to read Sargent's handwriting. So, I mean, I don't really know how to answer this question except that books teach you how to write them. don't you think? I mean, you sort
On a
of
good day.
find, yeah, there are many good days, many days that aren't so good, and you're floundering and thinking, I can't do this.
But it's an interesting question, and also you don't hew to strict chronology.
No,
So you kill off Sargent before you give us the details of Sargent's death as it happens.
yes.
Was that always, that sort of looping back and forth, was that something you knew at the outset? Was there a model of the form?
Not really, not really. One of my models, which ends up not, I mean, it's not very much in this book, but Edmund Duvall's Hair with Amber Eyes was completely something I was thinking about all through this book. But it's a very different kind of story. I couldn't really use a structure like that, but he did a brilliant job. Objects and a family story, weaving it through with a lot of history.
This requires a very simple answer. How many children did this man have?
Well, 10 who survived. There were 2 others who died, so they were very prolific, this couple. And yeah, and they, they were very wealthy, so they had plenty of help and big houses, and obviously it testifies to some extent to his virility, her good health, and their active, intimate life.
Gee, is there any other family where he paints every family member?
I don't think so. He did a lot of Vanderbilts, but it wasn't one nuclear family. It was through various channels of Vanderbiltism.
Jean, what drew you to this story? What was the first inkling of your interest in it and how it developed?
It's a long story, and I'll make it as short as I can. My Morgan book came out in 1999, and I wasn't looking to write a new book. I was doing some work in Seattle at the time, and there was a show of Sargent portraits at the Seattle Art Museum, which I went to see because I loved Sargent. He figures as a cameo in both the James book and the Morgan book. So I knew I loved his work, but I didn't know very much about him. And this exhibition was of these paintings. It had been organized by the Jewish Museum in New York, and it had traveled to Richmond, Virginia, New Orleans, which owns the first painting of Mrs. Wertheimer, and then to Seattle, where a curator was a Sargent expert. And so I was just sort of completely surprised and intrigued by this display. All 12 paintings were here, shown for the first time. Even Asher and Sargent had never seen them all together. And there were photographs, there was information about the paintings, there was information about that older, a little bit, this ancestor of this guy, the Wertheimer's ancestor named Samson Wertheimer, who was called a court factor, which was also called court Jew, banker to the Habsburg Kaisers at the turn of the 18th century. So I was very intrigued. And there was a photograph of Sargent at the Wertheimer's country house playing croquet with Asher and his oldest son and a couple of other people. So I just thought, this is a real friendship. These are fascinating pictures. My own family had come from southern Germany, very near where Asher's father had come from, at the same time, but had come to America rather than England. So I just thought, what is this story? I wanted to know more and how they'd met and what kind of their friendship was like. But as I said, I wasn't looking to write a new book. So I bought the catalog, came back to New York, took a very demanding full-time job, but it didn't let me go completely. And because I got in touch with the people who'd organized that exhibition, and I said, is there more information? They said, no, the family wasn't helpful. There's no more about the Wertheimers. And then I gave up. And then a few years later, I got in touch with the Sargent experts and asked what they thought about this. And the leading man, Richard Ormond, who's a descendant of Sargent, said it would be a fascinating story, but the Wertheimer papers seemed to have been destroyed and he didn't see how you could tell it. So I gave up again. One day I was noodling around online. There was something called the Sargent Virtual Gallery organized by a woman named Natalie Wallace. And the painting of Ina in the Albert Le Gonfier was there, and somebody had written in asking if anyone knew anything about it. And someone else wrote in saying that he was a descendant of the family and he didn't know very much about this, but he'd be glad to answer questions. And he gave his email address. How did anyone do this before an internet? I don't know. So I wrote to him and I called him and I went to England to see him, and he had three thick folders of documents that he let me take and copy. He introduced me to many of his relatives. One of them was 90 at the time and sharp as a tack, remembered lots of stories. She was American. She'd married Ina's youngest grandson and knew these stories, could identify people in photographs for me. She too had a lot of papers in big plastic bins in her living room, and I would go through them. I visited her a lot. I would go through them each time I visited, and finally I said, why don't you let me organize these for you? So that meant they knew what they had. There were finding aids, and it also meant I knew that I had seen everything. So, and then there were other relatives. So by this time, which was about 2012, I thought there seemed to be enough, and there would be gaps, but I could go ahead. Long answer to your question.
Well, I might throw in a question, actually. This is not related to the Wertheimers exactly, but obviously Sargent's whole career is during the time when photography is not only increasingly a thing, but increasingly a thing that everybody is doing informally, that you could buy a Brownie, Kodak, whatever, and take pictures of people. Did he feel complicated about that at all? Did he see it as a completely different thing? Or is there any sense that the window of the soul might be stolen by this new medium? Or not new at that time, but up-and-coming medium?
I have not ever found a comment from him about the rivalry with photography. I mean, yes, there are glorious photographic portraits that capture people's souls. He basically gave up painting portraits in 1907, not because of photography, but that's a whole other story. He had been doing it so intensively from the early 1890s until 1907, trying to turn people away, raising his prices so that he would have fewer to do. And he said in 1907 to a friend, he said, no more portraits, P-A-U-G-H-T-R-A-I-T-S. I abhor and abjure them and hope never to do another, especially of the upper classes. But he'd been roundly criticized by a number of English art critics, especially Roger Fry, who made it his life's work to attack Sargent. I don't think that's why he gave up, but I think he was just sick of it. He wanted to travel. He loved to paint outdoors. He painted all the time, his whole life, whether or not it was for a commission or not, but he just wanted to get out of the studio. So that's not answering your question about photography. I don't really know the answer.
But if I may insert a piece of advertising, one of the manifold pleasures of this book is that it has photographs of many of the subjects whose portraits are in the book. And it's fascinating to see the difference between, because you can see the art with which he has posed his subjects
Yes,
and portrayed them.
yes.
And the holidays are coming, and it's a brilliant book on the subject.
Thank you.
Is there evidence of Sargent having sort of extensive relationships with other Jewish families other than the
Yes,
Wertheimers? Yeah.
yes. He was especially close to the Sassoons, Sybil, Philip, and their mother. They lived in Paris when she was French Rothschild, and they lived in Paris when the children were young. And Sybil remembers playing piano duets and going for rides in the Bois de Boulogne with Sargent. And he painted her several times. He said she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever drawn. I think anyway, you can find it. There was a beautiful drawing of her. He painted her for her wedding to the Earl of Rock Savage. And Philip is that in here? I can't remember. I think it is. Maybe not. No, I think it is. Anyway, it's in the book. There's a fabulous painting of Philip. So he was very, very close to them. And also to a man named George Lewis, who was a lawyer, his lawyer back and his wife. He wrote a zillion really wonderful letters to her. And Mrs. Karl Meyer, which is another family of Jews, and there's one of his early paintings was of a singer named George Henschel, who he painted singing, sort of looking up as if to a conductor or a choir of angels or something. He's just like his wife said, "It's George gone to heaven." It's an amazing painting. Look it up online. And someone visiting the studio said to Sargent, she gestured to a society lady in one of his portraits and said, "How can you paint like that when you can paint like this?" Pointing to the painting of George Henschel, who was Jewish, I should have said. And he said, "I loved George." So he was very close to many of them.
Did he ever do portraits late in life?
He did a few, most notably Henry James, which is an extraordinary painting. And Henry James has a fabulous description of sitting for Sargent and how he felt about the whole thing. So I urge people to read that. He did a few friends towards the end.
After he sort of
said no more.
And if he
did some of John D. Rockefeller, I guess, because he
get out of
couldn't
it.
get out of
He
it.
did,
He did Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Did not like working with Roosevelt, but found Wilson very agreeable. So, yeah, he did some. He broke his rule.
He did Charles Deering.
Yes, he did Charles Deering, who was a good friend.
Early 20s.
Yes, exactly, in Florida.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Do you know what he found objectionable about Teddy Roosevelt?
That he wouldn't sit still. And he was constantly inviting people in to crowd around them, and it's just, it was really funny. It's still a good picture though.
Well, I think we will conclude there. Thank you so much, Stacy Schiff. Thank you, Strouse.